This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Welcome, everyone, back to the Human Action Podcast. I hope you had a good holiday. I thought, what better way to start 2025 than to jump into a fairly technical work from Friedrich Hayek. Now, don't tune out. This is good stuff. This is like spinach, but like Popeye spinach that you'll be able to move battleships around, or, you know, when he flexes and you see the battleship in his bicep, that's what this is. But I am being serious. This is a bit involved. Okay. Now, the context here is I am doing a chapter for a collection on Austrian economics that someone is overseeing. I don't know if it's public information yet, so that's why I'm not going to say who the guy is or anything. But oops, it's a man. And part of what I'm doing for this essay is I went back and reread the Hayek-Schraffe exchange in the early 1930s. And in fact, if you're a frequent listener to this podcast, you may remember recently that I had David Glassner on and we talked about that Hayek-Schraffe debate. All right, so that it's this same project that I'm working on. And I realized, you know what, I have to actually go back and reread Hayek's Prices and Production, which I hadn't reread as of when I had that conversation with Glasner. So upon rereading it, I realized that the way Hayek explains what we now refer to as Austrian business cycle theory back in Prices and Production, and so what that was is Hayek in the early 30s was invited to the London School of Economics by Lionel Robbins to give 4 lectures on the trade cycle. All right, and just remember, it's, you know, the early 1930s. We're in the midst of the Great Depression at that point, and Hayek is one of the leading exponents of the Austrian view of capital and interest and trade fluctuations. And so Lionel Robbins invites Hayek to give his perspective to the grad students at the London School of Economics. And so then those 4 lectures were edited and they put in, you know, I think they cleaned up the diagrams and whatever. I don't know if Hayek was doing it on a blackboard or if he had it printed out. I don't know the logistics of that. But that is what we now refer to as the book Prices and Production. And so, and this, by the way, everything I do here, you can get. The Mises Institute has free versions of this stuff in PDF form, you know, as they are wont to do. So I'll put links, of course. And so that's what Hayek gives. And he unveils here what later would be called the Hayekian triangle in its early form. And it was refined. And so by the time Rothbard uses what we call the Hayekian triangle in Man, Economy, and State, there was an improvement compared to what you'll see here in this episode that I'm going to walk you through. However, and I'll be clear as we go through like the specifics, but there was something that in words it was still retained, right? So Mises and Human Action, which comes out originally in 1949, discusses all this stuff in words. And then Rothbard and Man, Economy, and State has a very good diagram that's, like I say, it's actually an improvement on what Hayek does in Prices and Production in terms of adding explicitly interest expense into it. But then the actual illustration of here's what happens when there's a credit expansion. Notice the change in the structure of production. And then once the credit expansion stops and the consumers revert to their original time preference spending patterns, and then see how that causes a crisis. That particular chain of events, Hayek does in terms of figures, like, you know, diagrams in Prices and Production, and that's not done in Man, Economy, and State. So Roger Garrison does it in Time and Money, but it's, I don't think, certainly not in his PowerPoint, and I don't know if he does it in his book, but I don't think he uses like specific numerical examples the way Hayek does in Prices and Production. So that's what I'm going over today with you folks, is, to me, this particular numerical example, and I'm a big fan of numerical examples. Like, I think you really see something that jumps out at you when you see a specific example of it. It just, I was reading this on the plane going down to Florida to visit my parents for Christmas, and I'm waiting on the shuttle, and I just couldn't wait to get back to it. You know, like they make you put your laptop away when you're landing and such. And then I'm waiting for the shuttle bus, and I'm pulling my laptop out. I'm sitting outside the Orlando airport, just absorbed. I'm texting my buddy, like, it's so obvious what causes business cycles, and the Keynesians don't know this, or something like that, right? So to be clear, I already knew this, right? I'm a big fan of Austrian economics. I've written study guides to Mises' work and Rothbard's works. So it's not that this is a new theory, but for whatever reason, the way Hayek went through this example is in these lectures at the LSE, it just clicked with me for some reason. And I was like, oh yeah, like, it's just so obvious that, not that what I'm about to go over with you folks explains everything about business cycles, but I hope you'll agree, like, this clearly is a big part of it. And the reason it's so critical for at least economists and policymakers to consider this is that if the Austrians are even partially right, if what I'm about to go over with you folks in the rest of this episode, if that's at least a part of the story as to what the heck goes on, how come there's a boom and things seem good, and then all of a sudden there's a crash, and all of a sudden, you know, the businesses have to lay people off, and it seems like they were overly optimistic, and why does that keep happening periodically in market economies? If the Austrians are right in that this mechanism we're about to go over is at least an important component of the story, then it means the Keynesian solutions, namely of the central bank pumping in more cheap credit and or the central government running big budget deficits and giving like income support to unemployed workers and things like that, that's the worst thing to do. That's just going to make the crisis worse. Even though if the Keynesians are right, well, then their remedies are a good thing. And that's at least cushioning the blow and making, taking some of the edge off the pain. Okay. So, and it's not simply, it's going to sow the seeds of the next crisis. Okay. So, and I may have even said this at times when I was doing like a quick exposition of the Austrian business cycle theory for a lay audience, if I'm doing a radio interview or if I'm giving an after dinner talk somewhere to people who are not familiar with the Austrian school, I'm just trying to explain like, hey, what happened with the housing bubble and how come now the rounds of QE are a bad idea? So it's very common to say, oh, well, that's just going to sow the seeds of the next crisis. If you buy the story we just gave you as to why do we get in this mess in the first place. So that's why it's a bad idea. But as I'm going to show you here, Hayek argues in Prices and Production, at least, that it's not just that it's going to set you up for the same thing down the road. It's that when you understand the nature of the crisis itself, in terms of why is it that the structure of production, if it had been influenced by a prior round of credit expansion, an influx of money through the banking sector, why is it a bad idea once the crisis sets in from that for the government to come in and, give support payments to unemployed workers and things like that? It really jumps out at you that, oh yes, that's it, when you understand why the crisis is occurring, giving a bunch of new money to people who are then going to go out to the store and buy stuff with it, that actually is going to make the crisis worse. All right, so it's not just a matter of, well, is that the proper role of government? Or we're like, no, that actually intensifies the crisis. Okay, so since that is so diametrically opposed to just about every other school of thought, that's why I think it's critical to understand the Austrian perspective. And like I say, even though what I'm about to go over is certainly, Hayek was just elaborating upon the theory of the business cycle that Mises put forth in the work that the English translation of the title we give is The Theory of Money and Credit. And that came out in 1912. So Guido Hülsmann argues that if you read the actual German title, a more direct translation would be The Theory of Money and Fiduciary Media. But you can understand why they chose the term credit, because that just made more sense to an English audience. Okay, so to be clear, all Hayek is doing in Prices in Production is just elaborating upon the basic story that Mises told back in 1912. But again, my point, and the reason I'm going over this specifically, for one thing, is just a history of economic thought that the listeners of this podcast, particularly if you're an actual economist or if you're a grad student and you like the Austrian tradition, it'll be good for you to see this, just because, it's for the same type of reason I've been going over stuff like from Ricardo and John Stuart Mill with you folks in this podcast. But beyond that, like I say, it just, for whatever reason, it really clicked with me. And the Hayek going through this example stressed certain parts of the argument that the verbal expositions that I have seen elsewhere, it didn't come through. And also, too, the virtue of this particular diagrammatic exposition is that I understand now more why Mises and Rothbard elsewhere use certain phrases the way they did. Okay. So anyway, that's that. Let me, sort of as a last preamble here, element of the preamble, Hayek, I believe, really solidified his views here in understanding what goes wrong that causes the trade cycle, or what we would call the business cycle, because he had earlier written in response to the so-called paradox of saving. And by the way, what's great is the volume that the Mises Institute has in free PDF form. I think it's the title that they gave to the whole collection is Prices in Production and Other Essays, I think, by Friedrich Hayek. And what I'm talking about right now is also included in there, that it came out earlier, where I think they were Americans. They had a contest, where they offered a cash prize to anyone who could satisfactorily solve this paradox. All right, so I haven't reread this thing in a while, so my details here might be a little bit off, but the spirit of this is definitely correct. And what they said was, it's a bit paradoxical that how can it be if the members of an economy save more, right? So out of their current income, if they devote a larger share of it to saving and less of it to consumption, we as economists have this notion that, okay, well then that goes through the credit markets and then it leads to more investment. Maybe it lowers the rate of interest and businesses borrow more, and it allows for the accumulation of more capital goods, more factories get built and so on, and the society gets richer down the road. And that's one of the staples of material progress, right? But the paradox was, or the issue was, from an individual business's perspective, why, if all of a sudden your sales to your final customer fall off, right? If the consumers are spending less money at the at the store, at the Target or the Walmart or whatever, buying your finished product, the retail at the end of the chain, if they stop spending so much on that end of the pipeline, and that in a sense frees up either dollars or real resources, however you think of it, why would you then expand your production, right? Why would you go to the banks and borrow? Let's say the consumers don't spend as much at the retail end, and then they go put that extra money in the bank, and that lowers the rate of interest. The bank's willing to lend out at lower interest rates. Okay, but in that chain of production, going from the original mining operations to then processing the materials and having semi-finished goods, and then you do all sorts of other things along the way, and it ends up in a warehouse, and then it goes to the wholesaler, and then it finally goes to the retailer, and then finally the consumer, puts it in her basket and then takes it home. The idea is that whole chain of spending, production and spending, going back, through the life cycle of this product, isn't that all built upon, doesn't it rest upon the base of the retail spending by the consumers? And so if the consumers restrict their spending, shouldn't that have a ripple effect through the system and make the wholesalers reduce their purchases, right? And then doesn't that make the manufacturers reduce their purchases and so on all the way up through the system so that the guys mining copper reduce their sales and, they tell the workers, no, we don't need you next week. Sorry. Right. And so that's kind of the paradox. Like, how could it be that when the consumers cut back on their spending, that would induce businesses to invest more? Right. So how is that possible? And so what you would think, just through this sort of naive analysis, that if the consumers for some reason decided they wanted to save more, that would just cause a vicious downward spiral, and spending through all the system would just keep dropping in ever bigger cycles until, everybody's unemployed. Right. And so presumably there was something wrong with that argument, because, economists knew in the early 1900s that in general, societies that were more frugal and saved a larger share of their income, and that, more of the national output was devoted to capital goods, making factories and things like that, as opposed to just cranking out items intended for immediate consumption. They understood that was one of the hallmarks of an advanced civilization, and the reason like one country would have a higher standard of living than a different country could partly be explained by the training that the workers had and whatever. Maybe they had better schools and such, but also just that the workers in the rich country have more tools and equipment to work with. Right. So they were aware of that. Like, that's a very classical school oriented perspective. But again, the issue was, okay, we in a sense see for like on the macro level how it is that a society that saves more and devotes more of its output to the production of capital goods eventually, is going to be wealthier, have a higher standard of living than another one. But just in terms of the actual transition, it wasn't clear from any particular cog in that big machine. Why would it be if the consumers all of a sudden stop spending so much on the finished goods, the final ones at retail? Why would anybody else in the system want to invest more? Because when they look ahead and realize, no, the demand down the road has dropped off. All right, so that was the paradox. And Hayek, in this article where he's responding to this challenge, is reviewing the submissions that people sent in to try to answer this paradox. And again, it's been a while since I've read that, but Hayek was not satisfied. I don't know if they gave the award to somebody or they gave him a half an award or whatever, but Hayek reviewed all of the submissions, and I think he thought some of them were just flat out wrong, and then other ones, he said, yes, they're making a bunch of true statements, but they're not really putting their finger on the answer, what Hayek thought the answer was. And so Hayek was particularly suited to know what the answer was because he had been steeped in the so-called Austrian tradition. Right? So Karl Menger founded what we refer to as the Austrian school with his 1871 book, the Grundsatz, principles translated as Principles of Economics. And then Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk was like one of the members of the next generation who read Menger and then took the subjective marginal utility theory that Menger pioneered, along with two other people, but they each had done it independently. And then Böhm-Bawerk applied that to intertemporal affairs. And in particular, Böhm-Bawerk wrote a bunch on understanding capital and interest in this new paradigm. And one of the ways that Menger and then Böhm-Bawerk thought about things is they said, okay, you can classify goods in a hierarchy where the consumer goods are at the lowest level or the first order, and then the producer goods that are used to make consumer goods are second order goods. And then the producer goods that make second order goods are even one stage removed, more removed, and those are third order goods and so on. And so that was the way the Austrians arranged the structure of production, at least conceptually, right? So notice that was more sophisticated and more nuanced than what other economists did in different traditions, where they made a distinction between consumption goods and capital goods, but that was it, right? They didn't distinguish between a factory that cranked out television sets from a factory that cranked out screwdrivers, all right, or a factory that made components to build another factory. Okay, so you see how those are different. So yes, the other things are, that the TV set is a consumption good, whereas the other ones are capital goods. But you can see how a factory making parts that you would use to build a factory is more remote than if you cranked out a screwdriver, which would be useful to repair a television set. Okay, so like a screwdriver in and of itself, it's a borderline case, because you could say, well, doesn't the homeowner go buy a screwdriver? Is it a retail good? Okay, you can quibble with that, but you see the point that hammers and nails are useful to businesses in the way that ice cream cones aren't. Okay, but the steel and iron and so forth being refined at a much higher level, you can see how that's much earlier in the process of the life cycle of these various goods. Okay, so that's what I'm saying. The Austrians, in their schematic of the structure of production, had that nuance in there. And so because they had that framework, that's why Hayek now, with that background in terms of his training in economics, when he's looking at this question of how is it when the consumers, if they cut back on their spending in order to save more, why would that sort of give a signal to businesses to increase investment spending? Why would they do that? And Hayek gave an answer. All right. So with all that preamble now, what I'm going to do in the balance of this episode is just walk you through 4 diagrams, right? So you can pace yourself. Sorry, I probably should have said this at the front end. You're going to definitely, from this point forward, want to be watching the video. Otherwise, a lot of this isn't going to make sense to you. Okay, so hopefully I didn't just ruin your afternoon if you got ready and you're at the gym and I got you all psyched up and now you're leaving you hanging. But trust me, this is an episode where you're definitely going to want to look at the video version of this. And I'm going to just assume you are looking along, because it would just be way too... It would be pointless. There's too much stuff going on in these diagrams for me to try just to explain it to you in words. That you need to be looking at the diagram as I'm doing this. Okay, so again, these 4 figures are from Hayek's book, Prices in Production, which itself was just a collection or a distillation of the 4 lectures he gave at the LSE in the early 1930s, trying to explain the Austrian perspective when it comes to business depressions. Okay, so figure 2, and don't be confused, it starts at figure 2, so I'm going to be showing you figures 2, 3, 4, and 5. So figure 2, I've pulled it up here. The way to read this thing is time is on the y-axis. So you start at the top, and then time moves downward. And then the horizontal is showing the total amount of money spent on each stage. Okay, so the idea is that you see the top, the 8 there, so that's $8 being spent on a 5th order good, and there's $16 being spent on a 4th order good, 24 spent on a 3rd, 32 on a 2nd order good, and then $40 is spent on the consumer goods. Okay, that's the way to read these things. So we start out in an original equilibrium position, and let me be clear, in all of these diagrams, Hayek is neglecting the payment of interest. All right, so that's a simplification, and I understand why he did it, because there's so much stuff going on in these diagrams that introducing the complexity of having to make interest, to explicitly account for the payment of interest would have just been another complication. But unfortunately, it then does kind of weaken the punchline or make it harder to understand what's going on, because if you really get into it and try to understand why are people doing what they're doing, and these diagrams are supposed to be capturing, the result of their behavior, it's a little bit hard to tell the story, because in the real world, people are only going to be doing this kind of stuff if they're earning interest. All right. And this is something that when I alluded to in the beginning, and I said that Rothbard improved upon. So in Man, Economy, and State, when Rothbard does this diagram, he improves upon this, that he explicitly includes interest payments. But again, the problem or the drawback is Rothbard only does a diagram kind of doing what we're going over here right now, where he just kind of shows in an equilibrium situation when it's, it's a long, it's evenly rotating economy, if you know that phrase. It's just showing, this is like the Austrians' version of the circular flow diagram, if you're familiar with that from more mainstream approach, where it's just kind of showing, here's how everybody earns their income, and then they use that income to go buy the consumer goods, and this is how the whole system works, period in, period out, and it's a static setting. But in a more standard textbook with the circular flow, where they're just kind of showing like goods going around the circle in one way, like clockwise, and money going around the circle the other way, counterclockwise, they usually don't break it down into a structure of production. They'll just show, oh yeah, the consumers spend money on the goods, goods and services, and then the business people take the revenue from the consumers, and then they go out into the factor markets and they hire workers, and they pay the owners of, capital and land for their services, and then that's how you do it. And it just kind of shows how that all works out. And I'm saying, there's nothing wrong with that per se, but it sweeps a lot under the rug. Whereas here, the Austrian approach disaggregates the payments to the factors of production to see the time order, the sequence, and how there's like actually a structure of production, right? Because it's, even if you're sort of like assuming, oh yeah, every year the same thing happens, just year after year, the same thing happens, same pattern. Still, even if you're in this long run equilibrium, if the life cycle of any particular good that ends up on the shelf at Best Buy, if that takes more than 1 year, well, then even once you're in a stable long run pattern, the pattern has to account for that, right? That like a time zero, but let's say it's a 5-year process, in order, like to say, to go from raw materials in terms of stuff being mined out of earth, and then, humans are working on it and so on, and then it's just step by step keeps getting worked upon and combined with other inputs and things until finally 5 years down the road, you've got the finished product that somebody puts on the shelf at Best Buy. Even once you're in a long run equilibrium, if you want to explicitly model that, you have to show that, okay, yeah, time zero, yeah, there's goods being put on the shelf at Best Buy that are getting purchased by the consumers, but then there's also goods being processed that next year will be finally ready to be put on the shelf at Best Buy. And there's also goods being processed that next year will be a year away from going on the shelf. You see what I'm saying? And you have to be starting the mining operations at time zero such that if you followed that particular bundle of goods forward in terms of their life cycle longitudinally, you would see, oh yeah, at time 5, these are ultimately going to end up on the shelf at Best Buy. Okay, so that's what this diagram is capturing here. This is a static, stable, long-run equilibrium state. And again, this we're not explicitly including interest payments. So let me just walk you through this. And don't worry, folks, I'm going to spend a lot of time on this diagram and then not as much time on the subsequent ones, right? Because I got to explain how this thing works, and then you'll just see the changes in the subsequent versions. Okay, so here, the idea is, like I said, the stages are going from top to bottom, and the arrows going from the top, that's where you see it's called original means of production, in the Austrian tradition, the original means of production are labor and nature or land factors. Okay, and so then capital goods are the produced means of production. And so the thinking is that, originally we just had nature and the raw materials that nature provides, coconuts and various minerals that are buried in the earth that we have to get out, and our bare hands, raw labor power. And then we can use our raw labor power acting upon natural resources like, crude oil and stuff like that to then start making stuff. And then we can use the things that we're making can also then help us down the road. And also I should mention here, Hayek is not really worried about durable goods or fixed capital. Okay, so here, don't have it in your mind that, they're making hammers and that's how the workers are more productive. No, think of it like they're harvesting wheat in the beginning and then they grind it into flour and then they send it to the bakery and then they chop it up into slices and then send it to Walmart as loaves of bread. Right, that's the way to think about these goods in process. So this is called circulating capital, if you're familiar with that distinction between fixed and circulating. So again, the idea here is the 8 turns to 16 to 24 to 32. This is like goods in process that are just getting more and more refined and having other materials added to them as they get passed from one stage to the next. Okay, so we're abstracting away from a lot, but even as simple as this is, you're going to see Hayek's going to tell a story. Okay, so with these particular numbers, what Hayek is assuming is that at each stage, $8 is spent on the services of the original means of production. All right, so at that top stage, you're hiring just raw labor power and raw natural factors, like people, have arable farmland or somebody's selling off iron ore, stuff like that, and as the workers with their raw labor power. And so again, assuming away interest, neglecting that or abstracting away from that, in an equilibrium, long-run stable position, the capitalist who spends $8 hiring workers and natural, land factors is going to end up with goods in process that are worth $8. And then he's going to sell them to the next stage, right? So the people at the next stage, they spend $8 just getting the goods in motion from the prior people, and then they go out and they spend an additional $8 hiring more workers and buying inputs from the owners of land, natural resource factors, to inject another $8 worth of materials into it. And again, the material there, it could also include labor services. All right, so that's why it grows to a $16 market value, and so on. Okay, and then finally, in that last stage, at the retail level, the capitalists spend $32 buying those goods from the prior stage. They spend an additional $8 hiring more workers and buying some more natural, resource inputs, and then turn around and sell the finished retail goods for $40 to the consumers. Okay? So that's what's going on there. And Hayek chose these numbers. So for one thing, you can see how each step goes up by $8. Right? So the total payments made to the owners of the original means of production, right? The people who own the labor and the people who own the natural resources, is 8 times 5, right? Because there's 5 bursts of those $8 payments. And so that's 40, right? So that's not a coincidence. And so that 40 is exactly what is spent on the consumer goods. So it's showing here sort of analogous, this is like the Austrian version of the circular flow diagram, that in long run equilibrium, if this pattern just keeps repeating itself year in and year out, the owners of the original means of production get paid $40 in income, and they turn around and they spend it on consumption goods. And this is interesting now, so pay attention. In terms of standard GDP accounting, this economy, a Keynesian, using that standard formula, would look at this economy and say 100% of GDP is consumer spending, and there's zero investment in this economy. Because again, the total income earned is just wages and rents to land factors. And that adds up to 40, and 40 is spent on consumption every period. So a Keynesian looking at this would say 100% of the economy here consists in consumer spending, and there's no saving and no investment in terms of the standard GDP formula. But the Austrians say, what are you talking about? Right? And Mark Skousen really stresses this in his writings, but you can see it back here, that going back to the classics, this was always there, is to say, no, in this economy, to keep this up and running, this structure of production, let's say it's $40 spent on loaves of bread, you can see that it's not enough to keep $40 worth of loaves, however many actual, let's say it's $1 a loaf, and there's 40 loaves that are brought to the store each period, and the consumers spend all of their income just buying those 40 loaves of bread. It's not enough just to say, oh, well, as long as the consumers are willing to spend $40 period in, period out on loaves of bread, it's fine. This is sustainable. No, because there's a 5-period process to create those loaves of bread, right? You got to first harvest the wheat, and you got to make the flour and bake the bread and right? And so what needs to happen is the capitalists have to, every period, take their gross income and roll it over in gross investment and keep the whole thing going, right? So for example, that middle bar there, the 24, every period, the capitalist at that stage has to take the $32 he gets in revenue from selling the flour, or I guess the loaves of bread that aren't cut yet, and aren't put into plastic and had the tie and whatever put around them. He gets $32 from selling those things, just the uncut loaves of bread to the next stage. And then out of that 32, he doesn't get to consume it. He's got to just take that, spend 24 buying the flour from the previous stage, and then spend 8 hiring workers and buying some water and whatever from the owners of the water to then mix together. And again, it's tricky here with this example because we're not saying there's ovens, but you get the idea. So if there's some guy who has hot rocks that through geothermal processes are enough to bake bread with, and that's what this guy, part of the $8 he spends is to take the uncooked bread and go hold it over the guy's hot rocks. Okay, obviously this is a bit contrived because Hayek is assuming way fixed capital, but I hope you get the idea. Okay, so that has to happen every period. Again, the difficulty with assuming way interest is you're saying, well, why are the capitalists doing that? Okay, and you're right. There's no reason that they would do that with these numbers because he's just breaking even. But I said, in Man, Economy, and State, Rothbard tweaks it, and he allows for what ends up happening is there's an additional markup. So the capitalist here getting 32 in total revenue from his sales doesn't have to spend 32 to hire the factors and to buy the circulating capital from the prior stage. Instead, he spends less than that. Maybe he spends $27 and then he earns 5 in interest on his 27. Okay, that's the kind of thing Rothbard has in Man, Economy, and State. So it's more internally consistent, but it's more complicated. Okay, but even as far as Hayek's diagram here goes, you can see it would be very superficial if you just showed a circular flow diagram the way a mainstream textbook would and say, oh, the workers and the natural resource owners, the people that own the water and the hot rocks and the farmland that the wheat grows on, they all get $40 in income for their labor services and natural resource services each period, and then they turn and spend all $40 on consumption, and that's what maintains this economy. And the $40 just keeps circling around as income to the workers and the natural resource owners, and then they spend it on consumption. And, if for some reason something happened to that flow of consumption, that might shrink the economy. And you can see that would be missing a lot. Specifically, in this example, there's a total of $80 spent on capital goods. Or if you go ahead and add that up, you can see that those other, the 4 gray bars adds up to 80. And Hayek chose that number specifically, that it was a 1-to-2 ratio, that consumer spending here was only 1/2 of producer goods spending. All right, so again, just in this economy, of the total spending, if you look at how much is spent on consumer goods, twice as much is spent on capital goods, or what in Hayek's exposition he calls it producer goods. Okay? All right. Let's move on now. So now Hayek says, what happens if there's voluntary saving? So I will pull up now figure 3. So here, I'll now that we've gone through quite laboriously the first, figure 2, I won't spend so much time on these subsequent ones, because you get the idea. But now the idea is, Hayek says, suppose now the consumers but by the way, I should just mention, so in terms of the GDP accounting, the reason they wouldn't include any investment or saving is because those figures refer to net investment. Okay, so in terms of this circular flow and just day in or period in, period out, that first economy would be considered 100% consumption spending, because the other stuff would just be considered gross investment. All right, that it's just investment to replace what is consumed in the process. All right, and so now Hayek is saying that, okay, so the way Hayek's going to account for saving and to show that there's a more capitalistic economy is going to say, instead of it being in the ratio of 1-to-2, what if now it's in the ratio of 1-to-3? Okay, so of a total of 120 expenditures, right? So that in first economy, it was 40 on consumption and 80 on producer goods. So that was 120 total. Now Hayek is going to say, what if instead of it being 40-80, the 120 gets spent in the ratio of 30-90, right? So that 10, the consumers basically are saving 25% of their net income, right? Because that's 10, right? If their net income was 40, that they were devoting entirely to consumption, now they're going to take 10 of that and put it into investment. So that means total consumer spending drops to 30, whereas total producer spending goes from 80 to 90. And again, these are nice round numbers, and Hayek, I'm assuming, played around with the numbers for a while to come up with these nice numbers to get this result, that it went from 1-to-2 to now being 1-to-3. So you can see in this economy, consumer spending is a smaller fraction of total spending. And that's how Hayek is capturing the notion that, what time preferences have fallen, and people now are saving a higher fraction of their gross income. Okay, but still, we suppose it settles down into a long run stable equilibrium. So even in this new figure 3 that I'm going to show you, once things settle down, the typical GDP accounting approach would say this economy is 100% consumer spending. Okay, but I am saying in the Austrian view, which is much richer, you can see, this is a much more capitalistic structure. And one way to know that is, of the total spending of 120, only 30 now goes to consumer spending and 90 goes to spending on the higher orders. Okay, so real quickly here, Hayek has chosen these numbers in figure 3 so that it all works out, right? So he wants it to be still 120 spent each period. So all these numbers have to add up to 120, but then he also wants it to be that the bottom white bar, which is the consumer spending, is only 30, and all the gray bars have to add up to 90, right? Because it's still got to be 120 total. And then he also, though, wants it to be that the same amount is spent at each stage. Just like before, it was $8 was spent each stage, and since there were 5 stages, that added up to 40. So he wants that to be the same here. And so the only way to make that, so it's got to be the same number per stage, but now that has to add up to 30. Okay? Because he still wants it to be the case once this thing settles down in this pattern that the net income earned by the workers and the natural resource owners, they turn around and spend all that on consumption once we're in this new equilibrium with no more net saving or investment. Okay? And so the only way that's going to happen is you need more stages. So you can see Hayek added 2 stages to this. And then to make the numbers work out right, given that now you're going to have 6 shaded ones and the bottom, white one, and you need it to be the same injection at each stage, and you need all those to add up to 30, it's got to be 4.3. Okay, and then that works out, if you go do the math, that not only does the 4.3, added to each stage mean that you're getting 30 total on consumption spending, but also if you add up all those gray bars with rounding, it's roughly 90 spent on production. So that's why this is all internally consistent with the story Hayek's trying to tell. Okay, so that right there is the solution to the so-called paradox of saving. That challenge that those other economists had thrown out to say, how can it be that if there's a smaller volume of expenditures on consumption, why would people invest more? How can that support it? And the answer is, because don't just think of it as people investing in making goods to then turn around and sell to consumers. Because basically Hayek was saying everybody else was implicitly thinking of it just as like a 2-stage process. And yeah, you can't make it work that way. But if you realize, no, there's many stages, and that if the society saves more, it can end up in a new equilibrium that has more stages, then it can work out. Where a smaller horizontal lower level can support more total spending because there's more stages, right? Also, notice here a difference that the increment is narrower from stage to stage here, right? Before, each stage jumped up by 8, whereas here each stage jumps up by 4.3 with rounding in some cases. Okay, so that, again, it's a little bit off because there's no explicit account made of interest here, but that pattern is correct in general. If you are more accurate and you have interest payments, that what happens when society moves to a more capitalistic structure that has more stages involved, it becomes more elongated but narrower. Okay, so you're stretching the Hayekian triangle. Okay, and so the idea is, in this equilibrium, the market rate of interest would be lower than it was originally. And again, Hayek's capturing that notion by showing here of the total gross income earned now, 75% of it goes to capital goods, and only 25% goes to consumer goods, whereas originally it was, 2/3 went to capital goods and 1/3 went to consumer goods. Okay. So far so good. And And notice too, what ends up happening here is, if I put these two diagrams side by side, figures 2 and 3, what Hayek points out is when the consumers spend less, right? So think of it as, if you're looking at figure 2 on the left and figure 3 on the right, the consumer starts saving more. So instead of spending 40 on consumption goods at the bottom there, the bottom left, now they're only spending 30. And then, yeah, that does mean there's less spent on the second order goods, right? So in the first diagram, it was 32 was spent, but now in the second diagram, it drops to 25.7. So right there, if that's all you did, then yeah, there is this paradox of savings. Like, well, wait a minute. If consumer spending on consumption drops from 40 to 30, why the heck would somebody invest more in that second order good? You're right, they wouldn't. But then as that, keeps trickling up, at some point it flips, right? So the next stage up in the first diagram was 24, in the second diagram it's 21.4, so there's still a shrinkage, but then that flips. In the first diagram, the fourth stage was 16, but in this new diagram it's 17.1. And then, 12.9 is higher than 16. And then there's two higher stages that, of course, are bigger than 0, which is what those stages were originally. Okay, so that's kind of the pattern. That's the idea, where a smaller volume of consumer spending can support a larger total of producer goods spending if you have more stages. And then it is true that the closer you are to consumption, at some point, total spending on that stage is lower, but that still is consistent with, total investment going up. Okay, so that's the idea. And notice here, the money supply was not increased and the velocity didn't change either, if you want to think of that terminology. Okay, so the total expenditure stream is the same in both economies here. It's 120 spent per period in both situations. Okay, so now that we've gone through all that, the question is, Hayek says, what now would happen if we started out with this first one, figure 2, this economy, but now what if instead the authorities want to go from this, the ratio of 1 to 2 in terms of consumer spending versus producer spending. What if they want to do that, but they do it through credit expansion, right? So the commercial banks just create extra money and then lend it out to the producers so they can go into the producer markets and buy more capital goods and expand the structure of production that way, even though the consumers haven't cut back their spending. By the way, I should mention in that it's not a wash, right? Even though only 30 is being spent now, back when figure 3 on consumer goods, there's more total loaves of bread because now the structure of production has been lengthened. And so the original factors of production are now invested in the capitalistic process for a longer time period. And so just physically, if you have more time to work with, as Bombaverick showed, you can have a higher amount of physical output, right? So that's the point of it. That's why a society that is more capitalistic can have a higher standard of living, even with the same inputs, right? So there's still the same amount of worker hours and still the same amount of natural resources per period being pumped into the system. It's just the more capitalistic system, once you get into the new equilibrium, you got to wait. There's a transition period. But once you get settled on the new period, even just pumping in the same physical amounts of labor hours and natural resources, now there's more physical consumer goods flowing out of the pipeline, even though you're only spending $30 per period on them, right? And the answer, how can that be? It's because the prices fell, right? So for a constant money stock and a constant stream of spending, there is price deflation in the lower, all over the place actually, but particularly in the consumer goods. But there's still a greater volume of physical consumption output, right? So real consumption goes up, if you want to think of it that way. Okay, so now, again, what happens though if the authorities want to go ahead and promote that outcome? but the public doesn't want to actually save more. The public doesn't want to temporarily curtail its consumption spending and switch over to, investing more in higher order goods. And so that's what Hayek shows here in his figure 4. And so again, I can be quicker now with these. The idea here is, notice, so here I'm showing figure 2, which is the original equilibrium, next to figure 4 on the right. So here the idea is consumer spending is still 40 in both diagrams because the consumers haven't saved anything. They're just, nope. The workers and the natural resource owners are just going to go ahead and spend all of their net income still on consumer goods. But the authorities want to still make it so that there is a 1-to-3 ratio, right? And so the idea is, okay, you need more money now. Because if the consumers are still spending 40 every period on consumption, but you want there to be 3 times as much spending on producer goods, the only way to have that happen is you got to pump more money in the system. So let's assume the banks go ahead and do that. They artificially create more money. They lend it to the producers. And so the way these numbers work now in this figure 4, if you add up all of those gray bars, that adds up to 120 with rounding. All right. And so the reason Hayek picked those numbers is because that's what he wanted to show, that, we're going from, again, a 1-to-3 ratio, which is like more capitalistic. And so 3 times 40 is 120, right? So again, just so you're not lost, originally with the same volume of spending of 120, when it was 40 to 80, which is 1-to-2, to then go from 1-to-3 to make it more capitalistic, the consumer spending had to drop and the producer spending went up. But here, if the consumer spending stays the same, the only way to bump it up, the ratio from a 1-to-2 to a 1-to-3, is you need more total spending on the whole system. And so that's what Hayek assumes here. And then also these numbers work out. He's still got it such that we have now a total of 7 stages, 6 higher order stages, and roughly 5.7 is injected at each stage. And so if you do the math there, it still works out that in this new equilibrium, the total amount injected adds up to 40. Okay. However, there's a problem here. If this were sustainable, so total spending has risen to 160, right? Because there's 40 still on consumption, and now there's 120 on producer goods, right? So 40 plus 120 is 160. But the problem is, and so the credit expansion, they added 40 new dollars that are, being spent on average once per period. That's the idea here. Okay, but the problem is, this was not voluntary, right? It's not that the public's time preferences fell. And so Hayek's point is the original elongation of the structure of production that was matched with genuine saving on the part of the households, or the consumers, the original factors of production owners, that was sustainable. Once we went from figure 2 to figure 3, that could be a new long-run stable equilibrium where people were devoting a higher fraction of their gross income to maintaining the capital structure. But here, the idea is, no, the switch from a ratio of consumer to producer spending of 1-to-2 to now, in this scenario, 1-to-3, by the banks creating 40 new dollars and giving it to, the capitalists to go buy more capital goods with it and expand the structure of production that way, that's not sustainable. That if they stopped injecting new money, now here the idea is the ratio, this society, because their time preferences didn't fall, presumably will go back to a 1-to-2 ratio where, of the amount spent on consumption, only twice as much will be spent on production, not 3 times as much. And so that's the last thing we'll show you here is Hayek is going to say what happens now if out of this total spending of 160, the banks stop inflating and then, it reverts to the original ratio. And so here what I'll do is I'll move the figure 4 now to the left and I'll pull up Hayek's figure 5. And so what happens? We go back, we lose 2 of those stages and we settle in this new equilibrium. And so just to explain where these numbers are coming from, the whole thing, he still wants to add up to 160, right? Because the idea is the banks injected that extra 40, and we assume that the velocity of turnover is the same in all these examples. And so now it's 160 is getting spent, but it's going to revert to a 1-to-2 ratio. So in other words, 1/3 is spent on consumption and 2/3 are spent on production. And so 160 divided by 3 is 53 1/3, right? So that's what's being spent on consumption there. And then the rest of it is being devoted to producer goods, specifically 106 2/3, right? So that still adds up to 160, but it's now back in the ratio of 1-to-2, right? Because 106 2/3 is double 53 1/3. Okay. And then also Hayek's got it here where he switched it back to only 5 total stages, including the consumer stage. And he wanted it to be that the same amount is injected in each stage and that those injections all add up to 53 1/3. All right. So strictly speaking, in terms of the exact numbers, it's 10 2/3 are being injected in each stage. And so that's why Hayek kind of rounded. So that first one that's 10.6, technically that's, 10.666, and he just put 10.6. Okay, so that's why if you go through and actually with a calculator start doing this stuff, the numbers don't quite add up, but it's because there's, strictly speaking, fractions involved and Hayek's just rounding a little bit. Okay, so that's what's going on there. So, okay, but now if you compare these two, the figure 4 and the figure 5, you can see what's going on. And so what Hayek is saying is, this is the crisis. This is the depression. This is the crash, going from when the structure of production in figure 4 there is not consistent with the underlying time preferences of the public. That, yeah, the banks can inject $40 into the spending stream and give it to the producers and temporarily cause spending to be such that only 1/4 is on consumption and 3/4 is on production. But if that's really more capitalistic and long-term oriented than the underlying actual preferences of the public, once the banks stop injecting that money, the public spending is going to go back towards the pattern of only having it being a 1-to-2 ratio. So namely 1/3 of total spending is on consumption and only 2/3 are on production. And that's what figure 5 is showing. And so because of that, those higher orders, they're not sustainable. And so they have to just completely go out of business. And, that's the way the crisis is manifesting itself. And so finally, the last point I'll make here is, in this framework now, you can understand why Hayek says government relief efforts to goad the banks into lending more, or for the central bank to create more money and directly lower the discount rate or whatever in terms of its own lending operations. And just by injecting more money, that's just going to cause more of the same problem. But even just the government, doing make work programs, like hiring workers to go pick up litter and whatever, that economically speaking, that's just going to intensify the problem, right? Because what's the issue here? The problem going from figure 4 to figure 5 is that in figure 4, that new structure of production that was induced this boom, this expansion of the structure of production that was induced by the credit expansion is being supported only because there's artificially more spending occurring on production goods than on consumption. And so Hayek's point is, partly why there's this crisis now in the transition from figure 4 to figure 5 is as that money works through the system and then ends up in the hands of the factor owners, the workers and the natural resource owners or the landowners, they're going to spend more along the original lines, and they're going to try to spend a higher fraction on consumption. And so if that's the issue, that structure in figure 4 only works if the public spending proclivities are tilted towards capital, at the ratio of 3 to 1, you're not going to help that situation by giving the consumers more money, which is clearly what's going to happen, right? That if you're doing make work programs for people who are unemployed, they're not going to save a bunch of that. No, they're going to go spend it. Like, that's the whole point. Oh man, there's a depression. Sales are down. Business is slack. We got to get people to go spend. We got to, man, if only it were Christmas and people would just go to the store and just blow their paycheck on stuff, right? That's the mentality. And Hayek is saying, if I'm right in terms of what's causing this crisis, that's the last thing you want to do. That's just going to make it worse. Okay, so I will stop at this point. I hope that has helped you understand the Austrian diagnosis of the trade cycle a bit better. If you want to read more on this stuff, Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State really does an excellent job walking through it. Again, because now that I've warmed you up by showing you these diagrams from Hayek's book, the diagram in Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State makes more sense. And also, I encourage you, and I'll put links to all this stuff here in the show notes, folks, but my study guide that I wrote for the Mises Institute for Rothbard, I showed the what happens to the structure of production if there's a genuine drop in time preferences. There's more savings by the households. Okay, so Rothbard just talked about it in words, but I made a diagram consistent with his original diagram in Man, Economy, and State to show that. But again, what we didn't do is then show what happens if the structure of production gets elongated by credit expansion, and then if that stops, and then the spending patterns revert to the original patterns. Okay, so again, Garrison's PowerPoints, if you know those, if you've seen them, then I'll link to that too, shows it diagrammatically, but certainly in his PowerPoint, and I don't remember in his book if he has a specific numerical example the way I just walked you through here. So hopefully with all these resources, it'll really jump out at you. And again, the point is, if the Austrians are even right about one of the main things going on in a typical boom-bust cycle, you can see how the Keynesian remedies are the worst thing you can do. And so that's why I think it's so important for people to not lose sight of this, and why I think it made sense for me to spend this much time walking you through something that came out in a book in the 1930s. All right, well, Happy New Year, folks. And hopefully we won't see a boom-bust cycle anytime soon.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.